Although it's natural to assume that history is complete and therefore static, there are nuances to how the subject is taught. The facts are typically well established, but how a teacher relates it to their students' pre-existing understanding locks in how someone interprets history's greatest characters. Oftentimes, this is done at a subconscious level, with the teacher artificially influencing their students by how much excitement they show while delivering the details. At other times, teachers make conscious choices while painting history's picture. Take Mark Antony, for instance. The Roman commander happens to be one of the most influential figures of the Western world. Yet most teachers choose to depict him as a mere sidekick, becoming Robin to Julius Caesar's Batman. In my own teachings, I tend to denigrate him as a small-thinking man who does little more than carry Cleopatra's purse while she works overtime in an attempt to take control over the entire Western world. 2023's breakout movie, Barbie, has me rethinking Mark Antony as an ancient world's version of Ken. After all, at any other point in history, Antony would be a 10. The boy Barbie, as some know him as, was designed by Mattel as just another accessory for history's top-selling doll. Vox goes deeper into Ken's angst at finding himself always number 2, pointing out that Barbie Land is a place where kids, predominantly young girls, are in control of the story. The narrative, which continues to this day and is alive in Gerwig's new movie, is that Barbie is the center of her universe. In this world, Barbies are mermaids, presidents, doctors, diplomats, and Supreme Court justices. The Kens? They are just Ken. In the movie, it is the Mimbo's realization of his lack of purpose that causes him to seize control of Barbie World in an attempt to establish the patriarchy within a land which has only ever known female empowerment. In Barbie's world, there is no joint ownership of the dream house or their vacation home in Malibu. The assassination of Julius Caesar rocked Mark Antony's world. Like Ken, his center was suddenly taken away from him without warning. Brutus's most consequential mistake in the aftermath of the murder was that he had formulated no plan to deal with Caesar's right-hand man. The man who had the keys to his bank vaults, a legion of loyal soldiers at his back, and the only copy of the dictator's last will and testament. Antony's first thought was to plunge Rome back into the agonies of civil war. But after Octavian emerged as the front-runner in the hearts of the citizens of Rome, he turned to another to achieve his dream of figuring out who he really was. With Cleopatra as his new center, Mark Antony thrust the Roman world into an existential crisis that had the ability to fundamentally alter the course of human history. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon the rise and fall of Egyptian ruler Cleopatra. Episode number 4, Seducing Mark Antony. Although this series is about Cleopatra, we first need to provide Mark Antony a proper introduction. Linked by distant blood to Julius Caesar, his family's narrative unfolded alongside Caesar's rise, marred by tragedy when the dictator Sulla executed his cherished grandfather as a part of the purges that resulted in Caesar taking refuge within the Roman legions. Antony's father was a favorite target of the orator Cicero, but Antony earned his reputation by displaying a boldness on the battlefield while serving as a general beneath Caesar in the Gallic Wars. After they were finished with the conquest, Antony was left behind in order to govern the unruly Italian portions of the land that the Romans had seized, suggesting that he was far more capable than merely a Ken, at least in Caesar's mind. His Achilles' heel stemmed from his deep affection for entertainment, rendering him susceptible to distraction. It was a lifelong addiction for the Roman, as Plutarch notes that he spent his teenage years wandering throughout the capital with a group of friends that spent their days gambling, drinking, and seducing women. As his political influence expanded, so too did the scale of the parties, with historian Adrian Goldsworthy writing that there is no doubt that Antony took immediately to all such things with enormous enthusiasm and almost no self-restraint. There was a great passion in the man that seemed always ready to boil over, and which gave force and massive determination to all that he did. His oratory, his soldiering, as well as his drunkenness and womanizing, all seemed to have had a power behind them that came from his personality more than skill or training. Every task calls for a different set of tools. Caesar regularly deployed Antony when brute force rather than delicate thinking was called for. The younger man had not only demonstrated his loyalty and ambition throughout the Gallic Wars, but had also found himself beholden to Caesar due to his mounting gambling debts, a situation perpetuated by Caesar's seemingly inexhaustible purse. He was again left in charge when Julius Caesar followed his former son-in-law Pompey to Alexandria, Egypt. Caesar's prolonged stay in the company of Cleopatra afforded Antony the opportunity to showcase his administrative skills and prove himself as a capable bureaucrat. Unfortunately, as noted by historian Alexis Vuvik, this time in charge was the first time it became clear that his personality was much more suited for adventurous military roles. He found himself increasingly incapable of governing and grew unpopular in Rome. His growing mistakes, wrong decisions, and a cooling of relations with Caesar led to him being stripped of official positions, and his status was reverted to a private citizen. He managed to return to Caesar's good graces at the end, associated so clearly with the dictator that he was forced to flee the city in the clothes of a beggar after the 60 conspirators had finished stabbing the Roman statesman 23 times. Only when it became clear that the assassins sought no more bloodshed did Antony reappear for the public funeral. Upon his arrival, he let it be known that he was in possession of the deceased man's will. The boring facts attached to the occasion will inform you that the Roman ruler had bequeathed his vast fortune to the people of Rome, granting them each a sizable portion of cash, as well as access to his estate, which would be turned into a garden for all to enjoy. It also revealed that Caesar was elevating a complete unknown to the undefined role of his successor. The appearance of Octavian's name in the document came as a surprise to all, but it was likely even more shocking to Cleopatra and Mark Antony, both of whom had assumed that they held enough significance to the deceased to warrant a mention. Those who had stood faithfully beside the man that they loved had been tossed aside in favor of a 17-year-old boy who had never set foot in Rome. It would have been the equivalent of Michael Cera's Ken rather than Ryan Gosling being appointed in charge of the newly appointed Kenland. Delving deeper into the events following Caesar's assassination reveals a nuanced yet meticulously orchestrated performance by Antony, aimed at altering his destiny. It is Ken singing that his Kenergy deserves a chance to lead. It is Robin revealing that he viewed himself as an equal rather than Batman's sidekick. Historian Stacy Schiff tells us that at the funeral, Antony delivered a stirring oration. He was unshaved, a sign of mourning. On the Senate Speaker's platform, he hitched up his robe so as to free both hands. A proud and thunderous expression fixed on his face. Antony chanted Caesar's praises and cataloged his victories. It was at this time that he defended Caesar from charges of having delayed in Egypt out of voluptuousness, effectively alternating his tone from clarion clear to dirge-like. Antony delivered up a potent cocktail of pity and indignation. Never one to resist a flourish, he went on to display Caesar's bloodied gray head. He then rather unhelpfully stripped the shredded, blood-stiffened clothes from the deceased body and waved them about on a spear. The crowd went wild, indulging in the spur of the moment cremation and destroying the hall in which Caesar had been killed. A frenzied spree of murder and arson followed, during which, as Cicero had it, almost the whole city was burned down, and once more great numbers were slaughtered. The sight of it all was enough for Cleopatra to flee the capital once and for all. The Egyptian queen was pregnant during the fateful Ides of March. While others could accept Caesar's vocal denials of Caesarion's lineage, it would be impossible to deny that this incoming child was his. And since it had been conceived on Roman soil, this child, once born, would be an official citizen of Rome. If it turned out to be a male, it would throw everything related to the succession further into chaos. We won't ever know the answer, however, as Cleopatra suffered a miscarriage during her frantic escape home to Alexandria. Schiff informs us that in the aftermath it was decided by the Senate that none of Caesar's regulation, favors, and gifts were to be revoked. As such, Cleopatra would remain a friend and ally of Rome. Only 26 years old, she had played the game cannily and correctly, more effectively than any Ptolemy before her, only to find herself back at square one, blindsided by events, sabotaged by a wholesale revision of the rules. In the aftermath, Antony took the younger and less experienced Octavian beneath his wing while waging war against Brutus and his allies in Greece. The funds for the conflict were raised by the formation of a second triumvirate, consisting of Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. They issued between 150 and 300 prescriptions, death sentences handed down in order to claim the victim's fortune for themselves. The most noteworthy victim was Cicero, who had long used his powers of oratory to insult Mark Antony. It was only after the philosopher's head and hands were brought to him that Antony declared that their prescription had an end. As the empire grappled with political upheaval, Cleopatra seamlessly resumed her duties as Queen of Egypt. She likely breathed a sigh of relief at the continued peace and prosperity of her realm, a surprise to those familiar with her family's troubled past. Indeed, one of her sisters in exile was plotting a return to her homeland, while someone else in the country had managed to cook up a plot to convince the countryside that her brother/husband had survived the grave and intended to return to power. The rumor served as a reminder that she was technically still married to another younger brother, in accordance with family traditions. Knowing that the first familiar arrangement had gone so poorly, she quietly arranged for her 15-year-old co-regent to be poisoned to death. Her son, Caesaron, was elevated to the position of heir/co-regent alongside his mother. His crowning ceremony left none to wonder who the boy's father was, as he was proclaimed King Ptolemy, who is as well Caesar, father-loving, mother-loving god. Egyptian internal politics, however, weren't significant enough to cause any ripples within the corridors of Rome. Schiff reveals that during this period, Cleopatra embarked on an ambitious building program, completing work her father had begun at Edfu in Upper Egypt, as well as establishing a boat shrine at Kotos, farther north, and built a small sanctuary celebrating the births of divine children behind the main temple in Hermonthis, near Luxor. Education and philosophy flourished within the kingdom during this time period, as Cleopatra's people took Arab ideas and transferred them to the West. But what had been assumed to be the next golden age of Egypt suddenly fizzled out in the spring of 43 BCE, as the Nile, whose regular floods were necessary to bring life to the valley, did not stir one iota. The next year was more of the same, and widespread crop failure began to affect the entire kingdom. The queen did what she could, opening up royal granaries and declaring a state of emergency. Although each provided an immediate solution for her starving people, it resulted in long-term economic damage, with inflation steadily rising throughout the land of pyramids. Worse, the question of who ruled Rome was openly in doubt, with Schiff pointing out that so soon after the sudden death of Caesar, to back the wrong party was to invite disaster. While she remained answerable to Rome, it was difficult to do so when she did not know who precisely Rome was. Brutus had assembled an army in Greece, closely aligned with Sextus Pompey, an infamous pirate chief. The wealth of Egypt, once a powerful kingmaker, now dwindled under the strain of internal issues, a fact likely underestimated by both sides of the Roman conflict. Her first decision was to back one of the lesser-known factions that had arisen in the political vortex created in the wake of Caesar's assassination. The queen was a woman of principle, and among the Romans, Dolabella, a favorite of Caesar's, had pledged that if he emerged victorious, he would personally ensure political recognition of her son Caesarion as king of Egypt. Cleopatra sent Rome's remaining 4 legions that Julius had left in Alexandria to turn the tide in Dolabella's favor. In a stroke of misfortune, pirates intercepted her fleet at sea, compelling them to defect in order to escape with their lives. With her forces under their command, she faced the assassins of her lover, who came to her shores seeking financial assistance. They attempted to convince her that their cause would emerge victorious, promising to remember her goodwill in their impending triumph. But the queen, claiming poverty, postponed sending any aid for as long as possible. Soon, Octavian and Antony came calling. For them, she decided to personally deliver a powerful fleet loaded with materials that would aid in the coming battles. When the assassins' faction caught wind of her assistance, they began a full-scale invasion of Egypt led by Cassius. Schiff tells us that the timing was right. Egypt was weak with famine, Cleopatra vulnerable in the absence of her Roman legions. The historian describes Cassius as a Ken suffering from the disease of toxic masculinity, referring to him as a noxious character, composed of equal parts cruelty and greed. Known as the most aggressive of men, he had been a prime mover among the assassins. He had 12 first-rate legions at his command, as well as an expert force of mounted bowmen. Ultimately, it was timing that saved Cleopatra, as Cassius was poised to invade with 12,000 men, a force that Egypt would never have been able to repel in its weakened state. Brutus, the head of the conspirators, however, urgently summoned Cassius to his side as Octavian and Antony's forces had been spotted crossing the Adriatic Sea. The final battle was on the horizon, and Brutus, ever the idealist, reminded his colleague that the war was not meant to win power for themselves, but liberty for their country. The decisive action of the war occurred at Philippi. At stake was whether European liberty would succumb to the darkness of dictatorship. Each faction had divided its forces, leading to 2 preliminary skirmishes before the final showdown could commence. Despite losing most of his men, Mark Antony's forces defeated Cassius, who, in accordance with traditional Roman thinking at the time, committed suicide with the same dagger that he had used to stab Caesar. In Cassius's mind, this brutal act was done in an effort to restore honor to his family name. He had also erroneously assumed that his ally Brutus had met a similar end, likely believing that death by his own hand would be less agonizing than the fate his enemies had in store for him. The second battle, which involved Octavian, went Brutus's way, but the heir of Caesar had no intention of taking his own life. The young man had been unwell throughout the campaign, and on the eve of his camp being overrun, he had experienced a dream that urged him to escape for his life. The remnants of his defeated troops joined forces with the triumphant Antony, leaving Brutus unsupported after his allies' self-inflicted demise, with no reinforcements arriving. As the dust settled from the battle, Mark Antony emerged as the victor, and Brutus opted to take his own life. This tragic culmination signifies the irrevocable collapse of the Roman Republic, with Brutus epitomizing its last champion. Cleopatra steadfastly maintained that she personally embarked on her warships to witness the pivotal engagement on behalf of Antony and Octavian. Yet a fierce storm compelled her to swiftly turn back for Alexandria, her own safety taking precedence. The sole evidence of her endeavors manifested as fragments of Egyptian wreckage washing ashore on the southern coast of Greece. Schiff notes that despite her meticulous and expensive endeavors, she had garnered the allegiance of none. Having triumphed over their foes, Octavian and Mark Antony discovered that victory did little to bridge the growing chasm of animosity between them, a divide that only widened as they campaigned side by side. Octavian was more skilled politically, but Antony, the ever-victorious general, remained significantly more popular with the mob that made up Rome. Afterward, the details become murky, but Octavian clashed with Antony's wife, escalating their feud and risking Rome's descent into a third civil war within the decade. Her ambition was so formidable that a Roman of the era remarked, "There is nothing feminine about her besides her body." Rather than leaving her Ken to just be Ken, she intended to bend her husband to her will, to rule a ruler and command a commander. The fact that she had attached herself to Mark Antony, a man who appeared content as long as he had a barrel full of wine to share with a gaggle of women, wasn't going to stop her. She orchestrated political maneuvers on behalf of her husband, cleared his debts, and mobilized 8 legions to bolster his precarious position in times of crisis. While such ambition may propel one to prominence, Rome, weary of conflict, now yearned for peace. Her relentless pursuit of power necessitated a shift to safeguard the burgeoning empire from internal strife, once more tearing it apart. Fulvia, his wife, was never one to hold her tongue. In fact, the only tongue that she held was Cicero, whose dead appendage she pierced with one of her golden hairpieces in order to make an example of what happened to those who spoke poorly about her husband. As a group, they realized that Mark Antony, traveling to check upon their new territories in the east, would do the trick for bringing down the temperature between the two rivals. Surprisingly, Antony's decision to depart from the capital was the mature response. Twice Octavian's age, the military man rose above his youthful colleague, turning the other cheek after Octavian had bribed his bodyguards to abandon their posts at a time of his choosing. The young would-be emperor was notably touchy. He even utilized a significant portion of his recently acquired political influence to convince the Senate to outlaw the term mere boy when associated with his name. Antony left Rome to set up in modern-day Turkey and began to put the empire's affairs back in order, leaving his wife to spar against Octavian in his place. Emulating Caesar and driven by his vision of becoming the next Alexander the Great via a Parthian campaign, Mark Antony crafted a plan to accomplish two goals at once. He entered into agreement with Octavian, agreeing to split the formidable Roman Empire, which was far too large for any one man to govern. He would rule as the supreme consul in Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt. This move would enable him to further extend the empire's reach through military conquests towards the Indus River, mirroring the geographical boundary of the end of Alexander's conquests. Meanwhile, Octavian would govern the western territories, with Rome serving as the epicenter of his authority. In 41 BCE, an emissary arrived on the shores of Alexandria, demanding an explanation for Cleopatra's involvement, first with Dolabella, and subsequently with Cassius and his cohort of assassins. The Roman rulers had expected Cleopatra to arrive with reinforcements, and were quite curious as to this supposed storm that had forced her to stay put within her own borders. She initially ignored the summons, offended at the thought that Mark Antony could demand a queen to come to him. His repeated insistence on her attendance had a dual purpose: to gauge her allegiance and to procure funds for an upcoming military endeavor in Parthia, which corresponds to present-day Iraq. Ultimately, Cleopatra yielded to his pressure and sailed for Tarsus. We've discussed the Egyptian queen's intelligence and political acumen in detail in our previous episodes. There is no doubt that she sailed only after she had decided that it was the right time to do so. Taking care to leave capable advisors in charge of her kingdom, she exhaustively gathered and analyzed all available intelligence on her new political opponent. The 29-year-old queen was likely left disappointed, as the book on Mark Antony wasn't overly complex. His ascension to the position of dictator of the East had ensnared him in a life of extravagance and indulgence. His old rival Cicero had previously claimed that it seemed as if there were only 10 women in Rome, and in his view, Mark Antony had slept with every one of them. Women were only his first weakness. The 42-year-old general had also grown increasingly fond of lavish feasts, and there was always a full cup of wine to be found in his hand. In his newly established court, he invariably stood as the focal point, with sycophants eagerly attending to his every utterance. However, his constant adulation fostered vanity, emerging as his second vulnerability. Upon her arrival, Cleopatra adeptly exploited both of his weaknesses. Keep in mind that the Queen of Egypt was being summoned for this audience. Although it wasn't a criminal trial, she was being judged politically by a man who believed himself to be her overlord. A single misstep held the potential for dire consequences. Not only could it result in the invasion of her nation, but also in the execution of her son. One would anticipate the supplicant to exhibit humility, especially after having previously risked Antony's wrath by initially refusing to appear before him. It's probable that the two had encountered each other while she was in the company of Julius Caesar, but historical records do not indicate any meaningful communication between the two. When she first encountered Julius Caesar, Cleopatra had arrived as a young girl seeking help. Reduced to the status of a beggar, who had managed to gain access for a private audience in his bedchambers. Now facing one of Caesar's former subordinates, Cleopatra adopted a slightly different strategy. She arrived via the sea, but not atop a great warship in a show of force as though she were a victorious general. Instead, she arrived slowly floating towards Antony's seat of power on a barge, which had been left relatively bare in order to better display its passenger, who was dressed to invoke the image of Venus, the Roman version of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Schiff tells us that in a semi-literate world, the imagery mattered. Cleopatra floated up the bright crystalline river through the plains in a blinding explosion of color, sound, and smell. She had no need for magic arts and charms, given her barge with gilded stern and soaring purple stylish. As they dipped in and out of the water, silver oars glinted broadly in the sun. Their slap and clatter provided a rhythm section for the orchestra of flutes, pipes, and lyres assembled on deck. Had Cleopatra not already cemented her genius for stage management, she did so now. She herself reclined beneath a gold-spangled canopy, dressed as Venus in a painting, while beautiful young boys like painted cupids stood at her sides and fanned her. Her fairest maids were likewise dressed as sea nymphs and graces, some steering at the rudder, some working the incense that sent wondrous odors along the riverbanks. The entire city poured onto the streets to catch a glimpse of the queen. Upon reaching her destination, Mark Antony stood poised, awaiting her presence. Before the great game had even commenced, she had already managed to outmaneuver her opponent. The Greek historian Appian wrote that the moment he saw her, Antony lost his head to her like a young man. But Cleopatra wasn't done yet. Plutarch informs us that she was especially fluent in flattery, manipulating its dialects like an expert. Antony may have summoned her to Tarsus, but she intended to depart the city acknowledged as the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. Forgetting that she had arrived in part to answer for her actions in 43 BCE, Antony invited her to dinner. I would have loved to have seen his face when she refused, instead immediately taking the high ground by insisting that he make an appearance at her dinner party, along with whichever friends he desired to have in attendance. From the beginning, Cleopatra made it clear that the Egyptian queen didn't answer summons. She delivered them. Although she had just arrived in the city, she immediately proceeded to throw the most lavish party that the Mediterranean world had ever seen. Schiff describes it for us as a spectacle that has seldom been equaled for beauty. A scene so stunning that Shakespeare deferred to Plutarch, who had already pulled out all the adjectives for him. There were strung garden lights, 12 banquet rooms, 36 couches, and tables that were all encrusted with gems. At the end of the meal, the queen encouraged Antony to call on her again for dinner the next night, something that must have confused all of his entourage mightily, as Cleopatra had sent her guests off with everything they had admired, including the couches, the gem-studded tableware, and the wall mountings. This cat and mouse game continued into a fourth straight night. Each subsequent engagement was more lavish than the last, and each time she sent her guests home with the riches that were displayed. That act suggested that the money at her disposal had no end. Eventually, Antony attempted to regain the upper ground in this relationship, but his best efforts failed to match the luxury that Cleopatra had repeatedly produced, despite the fact that Antony was supposedly the supreme ruler of Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt. In the final battle of their flirtatious dance, Cleopatra bet Antony that she could host the most expensive dinner in history. Chronicler Pliny the Elder tells us that the Roman was quite shocked when he showed up to find a table set for just the two of them. Cleopatra then removed her pearl earrings, which are believed to this day to remain the largest pearls ever discovered. She then plopped one of the two earrings into a mixture of wine and vinegar. Upon the pearl dissolving, she drank her glass down in one gulp and handed her other earring to Mark. He admitted defeat immediately, but rather than laughing at Antony, she joked with him, playing on powerful men's weakness to flattery. She played up her supposed godhood by elevating him to Bacchus, the Roman version of Dionysus, the god of drunken revelry. She wasn't the first to make the connection, as Antony was positively obsessed with Greek Hellenic culture. National Geographic points out that visiting Athens he won the nickname Dionysus the Giver of Joy, and traveling in Asia Minor he was met along the way by a spectacular procession of men and women dressed as satyrs and priestesses of Bacchus, the Roman god of revelry. The citizens then bestowed upon the Roman Antony the divine title of Dionysus the Benefactor. But here was a beautiful queen, 12 years his junior, a god within her homeland, who happened to be the richest woman in the world, fawning over him while he was in the midst of a midlife crisis, married to a woman whom he had been forced to enter into vows with, and usurped from his destiny of ruling Rome by a man half his age. It only took a few weeks to wrap Antony around her finger. He was even left believing that the relationship that unfolded was his idea. After all, he had summoned her in order to fund his Parthian invasion, which was designed to erase his worst defeat from the record books. Rewriting that history would allow him to claim that he belongs amongst the great conquerors in human history. In his egotistical mind, history itself had set the two up, only allowing them to meet at the right time and in the right place. Schiff notes that Antony's Parthian obsession was a bold stroke of luck for her, allowing her to put her plan into motion without him suspecting that he was the one that was being played. Having wrapped the Roman consul around her little finger, the Queen of Egypt departed Tarsus with a list of requests. Soon after her departure, her troublesome sister was evicted from her residence within the Temple of Artemis and killed upon the marble steps. A Roman chronicler marked the event by writing that now Cleopatra had put to death all her kindred, till no one near her blood remained alive. The man that was pretending to be her deceased brother was hunted down and dispatched. The chronicler Appian connected the dots right away, concluding that the swiftness with which Antony acted on Cleopatra's behalf marked him as a man who was fully head over heels in love. He had become the version of the Ken doll who only saw his purpose in fulfilling the wishes of his Barbie. The Romans soon followed after her to Alexandria, where she spared no expense in entertaining him. It became one of their games, with each trying to outdo the other. It had to have been exhausting for Cleopatra, as she had a kingdom to rule, while he merely turned his residence into a never-ending pleasure house. The queen played to his vanity by granting him every form of amusement available, but to ensure that he remained beneath her spell, she never let him out of her sight. When he wanted to gamble, she would play dice within the city's finest establishments. They drank together, hunted together, and even pretended to be servants, wandering around the streets of Alexandria, seeing what trouble they could get into. I have a couple of close friends who would claim that Cleopatra's tactic is genetically buried within the female DNA, believing that girlfriends excel at pretending to enjoy their guys' interests until those boyfriends become husbands, who then have to pretend for the rest of their lives that they remain interested in their wives' hobbies. My favorite story of this flirtatious period, however, comes from a simple day that the two of them spent fishing. The manly Roman's sensitivity was on full display as his lover proceeded to catch more fish than him. To save face, he signaled to a couple of his servants to hide beneath their dock in order to attach some of the fish that they had purchased to his line. Schiff tells us that one after another he reels these catches in, a little too triumphantly, a little too regularly. He is an impulsive man with something to prove, never particularly good at limits. Cleopatra rarely misses a trick, and she does not miss this one. She feigns admiration. Her lover is the most dexterous man. Later that afternoon, she sings his praises to her friends, whom she invites to witness his prowess for themselves. The next day, however, she flirtatiously one-upped him. Almost immediately, Antony reeled in one of the largest fish that he had ever seen. Surely it was the largest that he had ever managed to hook. He expertly wrangled it in, only to be informed by the locals that he had caught an imported Black Sea herring. Upon inspecting his catch for him, the queen informed the Roman that dinner wouldn't take too long to prepare, as the fish that he had extracted from the Nile was already salted and ready to go. This isn't to say that Mark Antony was a buffoon. The people of Alexandria had attempted to kill Julius Caesar when he had arrived on their shores. Antony, on the other hand, had appeared without any soldiers for protection, confident in Cleopatra's assurances that he was safe within her lands. Perhaps surprisingly to the queen, the Alexandrians quickly fell in love with her new toy. But work eventually came calling. Beneath Cleopatra's spell, Mark Antony had fully let go of the rudder, and events from across the Mediterranean were now far beyond his control. Partly to draw her husband away from his new lover, Antony's wife had sparked a war against Octavian on his behalf. Because of her role in fanning the flames, she had barely escaped to Greece with her life and came calling upon her husband for protection. Simultaneously, the Parthians had invaded Syria, deposing Antony's newly appointed governor. Taking up his role of general once again, he first returned to Greece to admonish his wife. She wouldn't let her attempted power play go, though, beseeching her husband to reach out to the pirate chief Sextus Pompey, relative of Caesar's old enemy Pompey. Frustrated, he left his wife without saying goodbye. She took the departure so badly that she soon after succumbed to illness. Appian is among those who believe that she may have taken her own life. Schiff tells us that Fulvia's death opened the way for a reconciliation between Octavian and Antony. Now rid of an interfering woman whose jealousy of Cleopatra had made her fan the flames of such a serious war. The two consuls of the Second Triumvirate met and agreed upon the Treaty of Brundisium, which solidified the informal agreement that Octavian would rule the Western Roman Empire, while Antony was to be supreme in the East. To seal the deal, Antony agreed to marry his co-ruler's sister, Octavia. She was his fourth wife, and never willing to let a party go unconsummated, the resulting marriage produced two daughters, both of which Mark Antony named Antonia. In order to ensure that they all knew the difference between the young ladies, the eldest's full name was Antonia Major, while her younger sister subsequently became Antonia Minor. By all accounts, Octavia was a good and loving wife, but she wasn't Cleopatra. She wasn't capable of throwing elaborate dinner parties on a whim. She didn't take her husband fishing with pre-caught expensive imported fish. She wouldn't prowl about with him, drinking, gambling, and pretending to be a plebe. Instead, she was a perfect Roman patrician, smart but not independent, a mediator rather than a manipulator, a graceful and elegant woman who wouldn't be seen in public stepping out of line. In other words, she never had a chance in the competition for his heart. By the end of the year, Cleopatra had given birth to fraternal twins. There is no doubt as to who the father was. Within 3 years, Mark Antony would return to Egypt and set in motion Cleopatra's long-designed takeover of Rome. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on the platform formerly known as Twitter. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.